This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Aaron Matte. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The UN has raised the death toll from fighting in eastern Ukraine to over 5,300 people since last April, following the ouster of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych 1 year ago this month. Another 1.5 million people have been displaced. According to Russian-backed rebels in Donetsk, shelling in eastern Ukraine has killed at least 8 people and wounded 22 others in the past day. Ukraine says 5 more of its soldiers have died. This comes as the White House now considers arming Ukraine in its fight against Russian-backed separatists. Washington already supplies non-lethal military equipment to Ukraine, but there is a growing push to send arms, from rifles to anti-tank weapons. On Monday, State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki was asked about U.S. policy.
There are a whole plethora of reports out this morning that the administration is reconsidering providing lethal assistance to the Ukrainian government. Would you care to address those?
Well, Matt, we are constantly assessing our policies on Ukraine to ensure they are responsive, appropriated, and calibrated to achieve our objectives. We are particularly concerned about recent escalating separatist violence and separatist attempts to expand the territory they currently control further beyond the ceasefire line agreed to in Minsk, as well as the increasing toll of civilian and military casualties.
Okay, so it sounds like you're not saying no, that these reports are wrong. Is it accurate then to say that this kind of assistance is now part of the conversation?
Well, we haven't taken options on or off the table, Matt. It's an ongoing discussion. Obviously, we take into account events on the ground, but I don't have anything to lay out for you in terms of internal deliberations.
Well,
why would the president want to get into a proxy war with Russia?
Well, I don't think anybody wants to get into a proxy war with Russia. And that is not the objective. Our objective here is to change the behavior of Russia. That's the reason that we've put the sanctions in place. We certainly want to help Ukraine, a sovereign government, thrive and go through this transition period. No decisions have been made. I'm talking about the fact that we, of course, preserve the right to consider a range of options.
That's State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki. On Thursday, Secretary of State John Kerry will travel to Kiev to meet with Ukrainian leaders.
Last week, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev accused the West of dragging Russia into a new Cold War. He said, quote, "If we call a spade, America's pulled us into a new Cold War, trying to openly implement its general idea of triumphalism. Where will it take us all? The Cold War is already on. What's next? Unfortunately, I cannot say firmly that the Cold War will not lead to the hot one. I'm afraid that they might take the risk," he said. On Monday, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the conflict cannot be solved militarily.
Germany will not support Ukraine with weapons. I am firmly convinced that this conflict cannot be solved militarily, and therefore we insist that, on the one hand, we will impose sanctions if necessary. We have done that jointly in Europe, and on the other hand, we will use all diplomatic means to resolve this conflict through talks, or at least alleviate it.
To talk more about the crisis in Ukraine, we're joined by Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, From Stalinism to the New Cold War, is out in paperback. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor Cohen. What's happening in Ukraine?
What's happening in Ukraine? Gorbachev had it right. We're in a new Cold War with Russia. The epicenter of the new Cold War is not in Berlin like the last one, but it's right on Russia's borders, so it's much more dangerous. You and I have talked about this since February, I think. What I foresaw in February has played out, I regret to say. A political dispute in Ukraine became a Ukrainian civil war. Russia backed one side, the United States and NATO the other. So it's not only a new Cold War, it's a proxy war. We're arming Kiev. Russians are arming the eastern fighters. And I think, though I don't want to spoil anybody's day, I said to you in February this had the potential to become a new Cuban Missile-style confrontation with the risk of war. That's where we are now, and I think Gorbachev was right.
There was a ceasefire reached in September. What's happened since then?
Well, it was never honored in full, and the primary problem was, I mean, there were many provisions of the ceasefire which was supposed to stop the fighting in the east and lead to direct negotiations between the rebel government or fighters, we call them separatists. They weren't separatists when all this began, but now they're separatists. They don't want to live with Kiev any longer, but it was supposed to lead to negotiations. The main thing that happened is it required both sides to pull back their artillery, primarily Kiev, because Kiev was bombarding the capital cities of eastern Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk. That artillery was never pulled back. It was supposed to be 30 kilometers. How far back they pulled them, I don't know. But as you know, in the last week, those cities have been bombarded again. So the ceasefire was honored kind of marginally in the breach for a couple of months. But about a week ago, 10 days ago, the fighting escalated. Now there's a dispute because it eliminated the possibility of negotiations again. Who began the escalation? The State Department, you heard Psaki say it was Russia and Russian agents. Russia and the rebels say it was Kiev. But we're in a fog of war. That expression comes from World War I think, when there was so much misinformation, we didn't have email then, and it traveled more slowly, that the perception of what was going on was distorted, corrupted by news, and it led to war. The fog of war today derives from this, and it's worse because it moves so fast on social media news, is that you've got all this misinformation coming out of Kiev, out of Moscow, out of Washington, and for the three of us to sit here and say who threw the first punch 10 days ago is almost impossible.
On Monday, three prominent U.S. think tanks, the Brookings Institution, the Atlantic Council, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, issued a joint report urging the United States to provide Ukraine $3 billion in military assistance over the next 3 years. Former Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbott co-wrote the report. He's now president of Brookings.
In the context of what is happening in Ukraine today, the right way to characterize it is an act of war on the part of the Russian Federation. This means that there is going on in Ukraine today a literal invasion, it's not a proxy war. It's a literal invasion by the Russian armed forces. It's a literal occupation of large parts, well beyond Crimea, of eastern Ukraine, and it is a virtual annexation of a lot of territory other than just the Crimea. And in that respect, this is a major threat to the peace of Europe, to the peace of Eurasia, and therefore a threat to the interests of the United States, and I would say a threat to the chances of a peaceful 21st century.
That's former Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbott, now president of Brookings. Your response?
Well, he's much more than that. People need to drop their masks and say what their personal stake in this is. Strobe Talbott, whom I've known for years, was the architect of the American policy that led to this crisis. He was the Russia hand, as he called his memoir, under President Clinton, when the expansion of NATO toward Russia began. Understand what he said, and the rollout of this report has been coming. And if you look at the signatures, these are the leaders of the American War Party, the people who literally want a military showdown with Russia. Stop and think what that means. Stop and think what that means, as though Russia's going to back off. But the people who signed this report, and they've been bringing it out for days, are saying that he literally just said this, the future of the 21st century is at stake in Ukraine. Stop and think what that means. Then he went on to say things that are fundamentally untrue, that Russia has invaded and annexed eastern Ukraine. I mean, when the State Department was asked a few weeks ago, can you confirm the presence of Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, the State Department, which misleads about this story all the time, said, no, we cannot. So this is what I'm talking about, the fog of war, where we're being told Russia's annexed eastern Ukraine, the stake of the world is the future of the world is at stake here. And basically, they're calling for war with Russia.
We're going to continue this discussion in a minute. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. We'll be back with him in a minute.